السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعله منذ بداية الأزمة السورية عام 2011 وبسبب طولها وتعقيدها وكثرة اللاعبين المؤثرين في الداخل والخارج تم نشر العديد من الكتب حول سوريا على مدار هذه السنوات. لكن ما الذي يميز كتاب سوريا في المنظور؟ مع الأكاديمي والباحث الإسباني بابلو صباغ نسلط الضوء على مقاربة مختلفة لواقع هذا الصراع بين الأمس واليوم من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. البروفيسور بابلو صباغ من مدينة مدريد في إسبانيا ينحدر من أصول سورية وبالتحديد من مدينة حمص. هو الباحث في جامعة كومبلوتنسي في مدريد والمحاضر في التاريخ والعلاقات الدولية والصحافة الحربية والدعائية مع التركيز الخاص على سوريا والصراع فيها، كما أنه أستاذ زائر في جامعة ساسكس في المملكة المتحدة وفي مركز الأبحاث العربية في جامعة تشيلي وغيرها من الجامعات في أمريكا اللاتينية. شارك في سلسلة من الدراسات العلمية ونشر مقالات في مجلات دولية وإسبانية. آخر إصداراته هذا العام كتاب سوريا في المنظور، وقبله دراسة مقارنة لتغطية الأزمة السورية في الإعلام القديم والجديد اليوناني والإسباني عام 2017، ومسيحيو سوريا وفيسبوك أثناء النزاع المسلح بين 2011 و2015 الذي صدر عام 2016، وعدد من المؤلفات عن المجتمع السوري. في أكثر من مناسبة وحوار دعا الأستاذ صباغ إلى الوقوف في وجه الدول والأنظمة الداعمة للإرهاب في سوريا وتصحيح الأخطاء التي ارتكبت في حق الشعب السوري وحكومته الشرعية، ولا سيما الإجراءات الاقتصادية القسرية الأحادية الجانب التي فرضها الاتحاد الأوروبي، مؤكدا ضرورة إعادة النظر في العلاقات مع سوريا والتنسيق معها لمحاربة الإرهاب وخطر ارتداده. فعليا منذ بدء الأزمة السورية عام 2011 ونظرا إلى طولها وتعقيداتها نشرت كتب عديدة عن سوريا على مر تلك السنوات. كتاب الدكتور بابلو صباغ سوريا on Perspective من الضرورة الملحة لأزمة دولية مسلحة إلى واقعها الداخلي التاريخي. ما الذي يركز عليه أو يحاول كشفه، وكيف يعد كتابه مختلفاً عما نشر سابقاً عن سوريا؟
I will start with the last part of the question. One of the main difference or assess of this book is that it's written in Spanish. There are many books written in English and also French, if we are talking of Western languages, and there were not any academic scholar books on Syria written in Spanish. That's important to underline. We need in the Spanish language, which is a very spread language in terms of social use, we need to improve in our scientific use of the language. So one of the purposes of the book was that, of course, but that was not the main one. The main one was to explain in depth the reality of Syria, because when I saw what the media was saying about Syria and what other books, not all of them, but many of them were talking about the crisis in Syria, I miss many points of the real situation in Syria. I have a Syrian background from the size of my father's family.
So the name of the family, Sabagh.
Exactly, it's a Syrian name. Part of the family, my side, emigrated to Latin America, to Chile, and the other part stayed in Syria. So I needed to knew in real what was going on in Syria, and neither the media nor the academic book were providing me.
You mean the media in Spain? Or?
The media in Spain and the Western media, and also the Arabic media with some notably exceptions, but in general the information was not accurate. So this book wanted to fill that gap, and that was the main purpose of it. From my knowledge of Syria, because my roots, my origin, and my academic work try to fill that gap, and at the same time contribute to the Spanish language approach to Syria.
So, in this sense, sir, what does the book attempt to reveal, and how, as I asked, is this book, this publication, different from other publications about Syria, others that are based, for example, on the emphasis of the sectarian cleavage? Tell us about that, please.
That was the main difference. In general, the media, the Western media, also some Arabic media, and the academia has focused on the Syrian crisis as a sectarian crisis. My point of view is completely different. I underline that it's not a sectarian problem. The Syrian society is a multi-religious society. It has always been like that, which is a very difficult concept to be understood in the Western world. They don't understand that because they have never had such a society as we have in Syria, we have in Lebanon, and we have in other areas in the region. In the West, they pretend that societies are divided in majorities and minorities, and minorities, what they call minorities just from a quantitative point of view, have to do always what the so-called majorities have to do. It doesn't run like that. They are putting aside all the socials interwit between the different groups. That was a very important point. I went away from that sectarian idea. The second one is that, from my point of view, in Syria we have not had a civil war, as the media has said. When you talk about the civil war...
Civil war as the same as they try to draw the parallels with the Spanish civil war.
You don't have not a single condition that you found in Spain from 1936 to 1939 in Syria. When you are talking about civil war, you need two governments, proper governments, not supposed government or governments outside the territory. No, real governments with real armies, with real administration providing services to the people, and that. There are many authors that underline this very clear. I can mention Moro, Caliva, Sambonis, or others. So that's another point. I suggest that in what has Syria lived is more than an internal problem, an external aggression promoted by external powers, and of course taking advantage of real problems that Syria has, as many countries, but it's not a civil war, and that's a big difference between other books. And the other one is when you are doing the book, I try to use Syrian sources and from different points of view.
So your research was supported by on-the-ground information, from
Absolutely.
Live interviews from inside Syria. You also said that while some just wanted a regime change, others have more or less openly advocated for the territorial partition or dismantling of the Syrian state in some phases of the crisis, thus targeting not just the Syrian government, but also the state as a whole.
Exactly. The main aim of these external powers, regional powers, but also global powers that interfere in Syria from 2011 on, even though it was prepared in advance, was to divide Syria in statelets. And if you have, instead of a Syria of 23 million people, 4 or 5 Syrias of 4 or 5 million each, you're going to have weak countries that will be dependent on the will and the wish of
and the whims,
powers.
Actually.
Exactly.
Yes, yes.
Exactly.
Now, Dr. Sabbagh, you specialize in research, as we said, on Syria, propaganda and war, and the media. I would appreciate your assessment vis-à-vis the propaganda, war, and media coverage and approach regarding the conflict in Syria as an observer and a researcher.
In that regard, propaganda, we have to say that the groups that rise against the Syrian government, which are different kind of groups, you cannot put all the groups that were protesting
one basket,
in 2011 in one basket. There were many groups that didn't have a violent agenda. But my point is that those groups were weak in terms of organization, and they were co-opted by others, stronger, which really had, violent or more tough agenda. I think that these groups were very clever in the use of propaganda in the beginning, because they focused the propaganda to the outside world. And they did it in the framework of the so-called, I don't like the term, of Arab Spring. So they caught momentum. They did it in the right time to mobilize civil societies in other countries, which didn't know anything about Syria and didn't understand well Syria. But that was an achievement in just technical assessment of the propaganda. They used social media, and they focus all the problem in one person, which was the Syrian president.
Exactly.
That's a very well-known propaganda technique. When you have a complex situation or complex problem, such as the case of Syria, you reduce all that complexity into a single person which you can put a face. In that case, it's very easy to mobilize public opinion. But at the same time, when we are talking about propaganda, I must say that that kind of propaganda is good for the short term. Now we are talking about 7.5 years in Syria. So that propaganda runs well for 2 or 3 years, but not for 7 years. Because you cannot sustain that message 7 years. And when you said in 2011 that after 3 months the government was going to collapse or topple because all the Syrians were against the government, and that didn't happen after 7 years, normal viewers, normal readers start asking questions and said, well, this cannot be just because the Syrian government is strong in military terms. It has to be something else. If we talk about the Syrian propaganda communication effort, I should say that they took a very good strategic decision at the beginning. Syria was facing an international global aggression. It was, if you want, interacting with powerful powers from the region and abroad. You cannot compete against a large media industry backed by governments of very powerful countries. So the Syrian government, what decided to do is to focus more on the propaganda communication, internal communication effort, rather than the external. They knew that it was very difficult to explain in a crisis like that to the outside world all the complexities of a multi-confessional, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society in a very sensible area of the world. We are not talking about an external part of the world. We are talking about the heart of the world.
The region
which
here,
which
yes,
is the Middle East. And so they decided to focus on transmit an internal message. And the message was very good. While the external propaganda was saying that all was the fault of Bashar al-Assad, they didn't talk about Bashar al-Assad. The government talked about the unity of the Syrian people, and they emphasize the message of multi-confessionalism. And they stressed that who was supporting that way of life in Syria, of kind of society, was the state, and the state was represented mainly by the army. So that played well. They also understood well that in Syria, social media was not as important as outside Syria. Because in 2012, 2011, the penetration of social media in Syria was less than 20%. So that was not going to make a difference. So you have two different strategies. One was good in the short term, the one of the groups against the Syrian government plus the Syrian state, and the other one was the strategy of the Syrian state and government, which was good at the long term. And now we are seeing the fruits
the repercussions of this. Yes.
So there was, beside the armed conflict, proper armed conflict, we also have during this year a propaganda conflict. And in that case, you also need strategies, tactics, resources, and all that.
Right. I don't want to break the excitement. And, we have to get the people to read the book. It's a very important book. But we need to focus on other facets of the book, important facets of the book. But allow us to stop for a short break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود. لا تذهبوا بعيدا. البروفيسور بابلو صباغ الباحث في جامعة كومبلوتنسي في مدينة مدريد في إسبانيا والمحاضر في التاريخ والعلاقات الدولية والصحافة الحربية والدعائية يحدثنا من الداخل عن القوى العظمى وعن تبعات المواقف التي أخذتها إسبانيا وتداعياتها، إذ يرى المتابعون أن إسبانيا ربما تكون منقسمة ما بين التزاماتها الأوروبية الأطلسية وموقف متميز تجاه سوريا استناداً إلى علاقات ثنائية تاريخية، إذ في سياق الصراع السوري كانت إسبانيا صريحة حول الحاجة إلى التعاون الأمني والحوار مع الرئيس السوري.
Spain historically had a very special particular relation with Syria because the Umayyad Caliphate expanded to Spain. And they left Al-Andalus, and they left there a very deep legacy in Cordoba, for instance, but not just there. And they founded many cities, which you can see the influence right now. If you go to Madrid, Madrid is very similar to Damascus in the way the city is organized, with a very dry area in the east, but then you have a very green area, which is like Ghouta in Damascus, and the similarities are very, very evident, if you allow me. And along the years, in modern times, relation was excellent. Spain was one of the first countries to recognize the Syrian independence after 1946 and open an embassy in Damascus. And after that, regardless the political sign of the Spanish government, all the governments had very good relations with the Syrian government, with state visits from the Syrian authorities, the Spanish authorities to Damascus, Syrian authorities to Madrid and Spain and so on. And when Bashar al-Assad took power in 2000, his first state visit to a non-Arabic country was to Spain. That was not casual, that was a very powerful political decision. The problem was that in Spain, Spain has been involved the last 10 years with its own internal problems, political and economical problems. Well, so when this Syrian crisis started, Spain was not in the mood to...
And the Catalonia problem.
And the Catalonia problem, of course. So Spain was not in the mood to present an independent position, which was, according to my point of view, a mistake, because Spain ended up doing what France wanted. And France has a very clear agenda in the region, and regarding Syria has a very negative agenda in the region for the last not just 100 years, but you have to go even to the 11th century and the Crusades to understand that France has always wanted to transform the area into small stateless and cantonalize the region. So Spain didn't have an independent voice and lost this opportunity, which was a big mistake.
Today, where does Spain stand vis-à-vis the recent developments on the ground in Syria?
The problem is that Spain changed government in June. Exactly. So the new government is just taking positions, trying to understand the situation. So I don't expect a big change in the immediate future. What is important is that the Spanish public learned about these big changes in Syria. I have just been into Syria, and changes are huge if you compare with the last 10, 12 months in terms of security, in terms of economic activity, in terms of return of the people. What the Spanish government needs to know is that information, and according to that information, try to take a decision, because otherwise they are going to, get late to the developments of what's going on in Syria.
Right. Now, two prominent political scientists, they have written, quote, "The Spanish Civil War became a focal conflict in Europe, the ideological and military battleground where fascist and anti-fascist forces clashed while the entire world just stared. Today, Syria has become," and I'm quoting them, "Today Syria has become the key battleground of Sunni and Shia ideologues and activists. Some like to draw parallels between, as you said before at the beginning of the interview, between the Spanish Civil War and the conflict in Syria. Can we render what is going on in Syria for the past 7.5 years as a pure civil war, to be in comparison to that in Spain back in the late 30s?
not at all. There's not a way to compare what has Syria been through the last 7 years with what happened in Spain between 1936 and 1939.
But a lot have been drawing this comparison and those parallels.
That's a very easy way to approach to complex matters. Societies are complex, countries are complex, conflicts are complex, and you cannot reach them from simplifications and using old receipts from other situations. In Syria, you don't have not a single condition to talk of a civil war. I'm just talking theoretically. If you go to the literature, the scientific literature, you're not going to have what is needed to talk properly of a civil war. The main example of a civil war is the Spanish Civil War. We don't have that in Syria.
You don't have the elements for it.
We don't have the elements. So that's a big mistake, which has helped to confuse people. In fact, in Syria right now the situation is much better, but you cannot say that the crisis has ended, because you couldn't say when the crisis started. When you have a civil war, you have a day. If you ask me when did the Spanish Civil War started, I can tell you a day, 18th July 1936, and if you ask me when did the Spanish Civil War ended, 1st April 1939. You are not going to have this kind of thing in Syria. Because sadly Syria will have to face for a long time terrorist activities. Even the situation is normal in most of the areas and normal life, because that was what happened in Syria. You didn't have two armies, two government, two administration providing services. The country divided in halves, like happened in Spain or has happened in other civil wars. That's a completely, you know, mistake of what has happened in Syria.
Right.
I remember one of the visits I made to Syria. I did it with a delegation of members of the European Parliament, headed by Javier Couso, who's a Spanish member of Parliament. And we had a meeting with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And one of the questions in that meeting was, okay, Syria is already getting out of this third uprising of these groups which want a confessional state. How can you avoid a fourth one? The answer of Bashar al-Assad lasts around 7-8 minutes. So it's not an easy problem to face. The solution is that Syria has to become stronger internally in terms of social development, economic development, and be wise and clever in the way to deal in the international arena. Because if you have a weak position inside and you have a bad environment in the international sphere, like we had in the so-called Arab Spring, you have the best recipe for a big disaster, which is what we have seen in the last 7 years with all the suffering of the Syrian people.
Right. Well, we want to thank you, Dr. Pablo Sabagh from Madrid, Spain, professor and scholar and author of the recent publication, Syria on Perspective, for joining us, sir.
Thank you very much. My honor, my pleasure.
Always welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadin.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل. من كل فريق عمل برنامج من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.